2024 was a landmark year for the Zelda franchise. Not only was Echoes of Wisdom the first major mainline Zelda title to feature the eponymous princess in the lead role, but it was also the first original single-player Zelda title made by Grezzo, and a substantive break with almost all the prior 2D or top-down Zelda team. About a year ago, I made a video exploring the fate of the top-down Zelda team that was, and explained how it seemed to me that the team was essentially gone. Now it is possible to update that video to tell the story of the team that ceased to be, and to show how the top-down team has essentially been rebooted almost completely. To give you an idea of the scale of the change, while the 2015 team who took on the multiplayer Triforce Heroes was Grezzo-led, and there was a greater degree of overlap, only a handful of individuals from the credits for 2013's A Link Between Worlds returned in Echoes of Wisdom's credits. And once you strip out the special thanks credits, the voice actors, and the testers, and focus only on the core staff of Echoes of Wisdom compared with the core staff of A Link Between Worlds, the overlap is almost non-existent. First, there is Makoto Miyanaga, who was a special thanks credit on A Link Between Worlds and returned as a concept planner for Echoes of Wisdom. Although he began his work for Nintendo in the 90s, designing courses and maps for games such as Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, and the first two Pikmin titles, his long-time association with the Zelda team has included working as a production manager on Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and as an assistant producer on Zelda Breath of the Wild. Then there's Associate Graphics Director for Echoes of Wisdom Koji Takahashi, who was a character lead on A Link Between Worlds after a reasonably long history of designing characters for Zelda, including on Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and as a design lead on Spirit Tracks. Keijiro Inui was credited as an associate graphics director as well, but this seems to be alongside other projects he's been working on recently, including a supervisory role for Super Mario RPG. The associate events director of Echoes of Wisdom, Daisuke Nobori, has a history with the mainline games as well, and was given a special thanks shout-out back on A Link Between Worlds. Alongside these four names is one person with extensive Nintendo experience, and here I have to chalk up a bit of a win since Yoichi Yamada is credited as the planning supervisor for Echoes of Wisdom, and those who watched my video last summer will recall that his absence entirely from the Tears of the Kingdom credits made me suspect that he would be behind Echoes of Wisdom. Now, it's true that he wasn't the director of the game, but nevertheless, as a planning supervisor, he clearly has a very senior role in the top-down Zelda team. Of Yamada, allow me to quote my previous video. Yamada-san is truly a Zelda veteran. He was the assistant director on 1991's A Link to the Past, and after some time kibitzing on Star Fox, Star Fox 2, working as a course director on Super Mario 64, and putting together the demo sequence to Wave Race 64, he has returned to being almost exclusively a Zelda machine. Check out this credit list, and in particular, take note of the specific games where he served as a supervisor. Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, the Four Swords section of the Game Boy Advance, A Link to the Past and Four Swords title, and Minish Cap. All of these were directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi over at Capcom. Basically, he has a long experience of supervising external companies and making sure they deliver a Nintendo quality product. He also supervised the DS titles Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, and returned to supervising the original elements of Link's Awakening, which presumably included primarily the gameplay mechanics of the chamber dungeons. Then he was also in the planning team for Skyward Sword, A Link Between Worlds, and Breath of the Wild. Okay, so only 5 people from the body of the Echoes of Wisdom staff have been in the trenches on the prior single-player top-down Zelda games. Granted, A Link Between Worlds was 11 years prior, and there have been other Zeldas since, including Link's Awakening and Triforce Heroes, but recall that Nintendo has been touting all this time that it still has a 2D Zelda team, and yet it doesn't really seem that way. Yamada seems like the closest person Nintendo has to someone embedded in the the top-down Zelda team exclusively, and of course Eiji Aonuma remains in overall charge of the Zelda franchise, but it still seems curious that the team leading one of Nintendo's premier franchises was allowed to basically disintegrate. So what happened? To understand what the considerations could have been at Nintendo's development headquarters EPD, we need to see how Nintendo views the 2D games, and particularly 2D Zelda. For a long time, top-down Zelda was simply the handheld version of Zelda, the version of Zelda that the relatively underpowered handhelds could cope with. Since N64, 3D games were the preserve of the home console, and 2D titles stuck to handhelds, and never would they cross over. Well, except briefly for Four Swords Adventure on GameCube. This held true until 2009 Spirit Tracks, but with the arrival of the 3DS, everything changed. For the first time, a system was capable of running good quality 3D titles, and suddenly 2D titles were no longer mandated by tech requirements, but just one option for developers. It should be said that the Mario Brothers titles had a very different approach. For better or worse, there is an incredible level of consistency between the console and handheld games, and even Super Mario Run. Ideas are ideas after all. But for the Zelda team, different considerations began to take root. 2013's A Link Between Worlds was not just a new 2D game, but a chance to prototype a new concept, dungeons that can be tackled in any order. With its largely reused world map and experimental approach, this was the first time that 2D Zelda felt like it was serving up a prototype for a new kind of play before they went full tilt into the development of the vastly more expansive and expensive Breath of the Wild. Indeed, you could even say that reusing a past world map but building a new game on top of it made it a proof of concept just as much for Tears of the Kingdom. And as part of the development for Breath of the Wild, they went even further down the route of using 2D Zelda as a prototype, creating a version of their chemistry engine in a version of the 1986 original title. I think it is notable, therefore, that a huge chunk of the A Link Between Worlds team carried over to Breath of the Wild, including the planning lead, the chief field planner, the entire dungeon planning team, half of the script and system programming team, as well as a good chunk of the people on programming support, player design, NPC design, field design, dungeon design, and the cinema scene design team. It is not a majority of the team, but when you consider that the most senior people had moved on as well, more on them in a moment, it is evident that the 2D Zelda group was heavily being leaned on to support the formation of Breath of the Wild. And in a sense, we can see that in the decision in 2015 to commission Grezzo for a 2D game at all. Grezzo wouldn't have been required had Nintendo felt that they could continue making top-down titles without hindrance in-house. To see how different this is, look at the groups for Mario. The 2D and 3D Mario teams are not just separate teams, but they are clear across the country from each other, with the 3D team having moved to Tokyo in 2003. They both work on Mario, but they have different leaders, different directors, and to a large degree they have been separate from each other for a very long time. Now, there was a bit more cross-pollination of the groups recently, with the Super Mario Bros. Wonder game gaining the wisdom from Super Mario 3D World director Koichi Hayashida. Another key 2D Mario figure who came from outside the core group was A Link Between Worlds' Shiro Mori. But for all intents and purposes, the two groups functioned as independent entities. And why not? After all, the 3D and 2D Marios have very distinct traditions and styles, especially for those Mario games that embrace the sandbox approach, like Sunshine and Odyssey. That's just not the case with the Zelda games, who come under the same production group. Now, there were two distinct teams all the same, and Eiji Aonuma certainly wanted them to have a distinct approach from each other. In a 2017 interview, when Game Informer suggested that the mainline Zeldas would benefit from absorbing the 2D team, Eiji Aonuma rebutted that the 2D Zelda team would continue alongside the 3D Zelda group. He said, "The dev pace is not really dependent on how many people are on the team, so combining them would not necessarily expedite the development pace. The 3DS team and the Wii U team have different approaches to game development, so I don't necessarily want to combine them and have them think together, but rather have each think about what they can bring to Nintendo Switch from their own perspective." But where is that team now? If we look at the three most senior people on A Link Between Worlds, their career trajectory since very much tells a story of the disintegration of the 2D Zelda team. A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes director Hiromasa Shikata seem to have parted ways with EPD3 during the restructuring of Nintendo's development teams in September 2015. He has since progressed to developing 1-2-Switch and its sequel in a more senior producerial role. And as mentioned before, Shiromori has also had a remarkable career uptake, but not in Zelda. After Triforce Heroes, he progressed to working on 2D Mario titles, starting with directing New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe and supporting over on Super Mario Maker 2, before headlining the most important 2D Mario in well over a decade as the director of Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Finally, the third Musketeer, sub-director and planning lead Kentaro Tominaga has stayed with EPD3 and is developing Zelda games, and has even moved up to the role of director. What did he direct? Why, the expansion pass for Breath of the Wild. Yes, in this case he was poached by the 3D part of the Zelda team, which now seemed to have become completely dominant. Other key figures from the 2D era, such as director of the DS games and supervisor of the 3DS Zeldas, Daiki Iwamoto, has also been dragooned back into the fold of the 3D games, working on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. For all intents and purposes, it seems that for a decade now, there has not been a discrete 2D Zelda team in-house at Nintendo, with Link's Awakening and Echoes of Wisdom handled pretty much exclusively by the external team at Grezzo under the producership of Eiji Aonuma and with the involvement of Yoichi Yamada. My contention, therefore, is that while there was notionally still a top-down or 2D Zelda team in-house when Eiji Aonuma spoke, and certainly there were individuals with 2D Zelda experience at Nintendo, the last game that was fully created for the sake of being a discrete series of games was Spirit Tracks. A Link Between Worlds seemed to be very much a test for the kind of gameplay that would define Breath of the Wild, and the two games teams began integrating heavily after that, allowing the rest of the A Link Between Worlds developers to assist on other Switch projects such as 1-2-Switch and 2D Mario. Look, there's no reason why Nintendo should keep the band together for its own sake. It's certainly true that some teams have remained rather cohesive over the years, and we can see examples such as the 3D Mario and even the Zelda teams of key figures rising through the ranks. But it's also understandable, considering where Nintendo was in the mid-2010s, that they pushed their star developers towards the vastly more consequential Breath of the Wild, which, after all, was the rock upon which the Switch built its towering success today. It should also be recalled that the 2D Zelda team did not have any deep roots at Nintendo. Ocarina of Time inherited many people from the original Zelda titles, and so they drafted in Capcom to develop the top-down Zeldas from the Oracle's titles through to Minish Cap. In this sense, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks were the exceptions, and while having two teams sort of worked in the glory days of Wii and DS, where Nintendo's coffers were dribbling cash, in the more austere age of the Wii U, it was natural that the two teams would not persist. For now, it seems like Grezzo are firmly established as the top-down Zelda team, with Grezzo's own Satoshi Terada being the first external figure, with the exception of Hidemaru Fujibayashi, to direct an original Zelda. Veteran supervisor Yoichi Yamada is likely to continue with the team, and obviously Eiji Aonuma continues to oversee, but my hunch is that Grezzo and new producers, such as Nintendo coordinator turned Echoes of Wisdom director Tomomi Sano, will end up being major players in years to come. And it's only natural that the team should evolve over time. As a fan of these titles, I'm pretty excited to see where this goes next, and Aonuma's comments around the launch of Echoes of Wisdom gave every indication that the next 2D top-down Zelda may already be in development. Thank you for watching, commenting, sharing and subscribing. Do check out my Patreon, and I recommend this playlist with a lot more of my Zelda deep dives for more. Thank you, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.